Have you been healing the child within or hurting the child within? It's not your fault, but this is your responsibility. It's your responsibility to clean up the unconscious patterns that you've learned from parents and teachers. And I've got 5 psychology books in total to help you run the full spectrum of inner child psychology and take you from the beginner to the advanced level with self-reparenting and actually integrating the inner child archetype so that you don't fall into these common pitfalls that I keep seeing over and over again. The 7 points I'm going to work through, I'm going to be as condensed as possible, and by the end of this video, you will feel confident to have identified at least 2 or 3 of the very, very, very common and yet nonetheless very unconscious traps that people keep seeming to fall into. I fell into them myself. I understand why we do this, but let's begin with the very first point, which is that the inner child is not a single age. If I ask you to name a child, you could have named a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, or even a 15-year-old. Legally speaking, it's between 0 and 18, and this might seem like a banal or arbitrarily fruity point. Why am I being so technical? But it matters. It matters tremendously because if you conceptualize your inner child as just a 6-year-old or just a 12-year-old, because that's when the trauma was. There was a divorce at age 12, there was a family death at age 6, there was a moment of abuse at age 8, and you're primarily focused on that one age where it is the most painful, you miss both chapters on either side. And there's 18 years that you're working with. People get stuck in the beginner level of inner child work because they've made a very confident, very healing step towards the most painful point of their childhood. For me personally, my main inner child trauma was around the age of 10. So when I started inner child work, I looked at what was happening when I was in my final year of primary school and about the beginning of secondary school, age 10 to age 11. But of course, this eventually ran out of usefulness. I didn't look beyond or look before, and when you start stretching the timeline, you look at the developmental issues, and you look at the progressive issues for the inner adolescent. There is no such thing as a single inner child. John Bradshaw popularized this in his fantastic book Homecoming, which talks about the many ages of your inner children and how you ultimately need to get them holding hands in a row or like Russian dolls embedded within each other. This is a fantastic image. Even on the front, imagine that the inner toddler is within the inner child, within the inner prepubescent, within the inner adolescent, and even late-stage adolescence extending beyond the age of 18, especially in our modern world. When does childhood truly end psychologically? It's an important point to begin this video with, because if you are making the same mistake of treating your inner child as just a single age, again, usually the most traumatizing or difficult age, it's when we tend to focus, just consider looking 5 years earlier and 5 years later. You'll instantly get some unlocks and some insights that you've probably been overlooking. Let's move on to the second mistake that I see people making, and that's that they don't understand that the inner child needs 2 parents. And you're probably expressing an unconscious preference to one style of parenting or the other. Generally speaking, it's a big stereotype, but generally speaking, there's the mother principle and the father principle. There's unconditional compassion and love and softness and understanding on the mother or feminine-centric side of parenting. And then there's the order, there's the structure, there's the discipline, there's the conditional respect and the things which must be done on the father side of parenting. Societally speaking, we're suffering from very weak fathers and very anxious mothers. Sometimes we have very strong mothers and very anxious fathers, but generally speaking, the inner child space is saturated. And I mean truly saturated by the mother principle. You're not seeing inner child videos about getting your child structured and disciplined, because that seems tyrannical. It seems like that would be a waste of your time, and it seems like it would almost be oppressive. And yet the reality for many inner children, for many of the children that we were, is that there was a bit too much chaos in the home. Maybe there was a super rigid father figure, but for many of us, statistically speaking, the father figure was absent, either literally or emotionally, and to have some healthy guidelines about when you go to school, when you come home, when it's time for work, when it's time for play, when the homework needs to be done, and most importantly, when it's time to not spend time on the screen, has very strong implications towards our everyday existence. It's not just the inner child that needs to be reparented. It's the mother principle and the father principle, the feminine and the masculine, as embodied and integrated in our life philosophy. There's a time for compassion and a time for order. There's a time for softness, a time for structure. I'm generalizing, but hopefully you get the point. Just pause to reflect on your own inner child healing journey and notice if you have a bias towards the mother or the father principle, and understand that ideally, from a developmental perspective, the child needs both parents. They need a mother and a father, not just a healthy mother and no father, not just a healthy father and no mother. And if you're looking to get to that advanced stage of inner work, consider building out the opposite. You might have a bias based on your favorite parent. For most people, they'll typically replicate the parenting that felt most healing towards them. For example, if you're a woman and you had a particularly wonderful father, you'll parent your inner child with more of a fatherly nature. Even if you're quite a feminine woman, you'll notice this unconsciously. So bring in the mother principle, because maybe you've got some shadow boxing issues or some ongoing mother wounds or mother complex issues. You just fill that out, and the inverse is true if you naturally have more of a loving relationship with your mother. Try filling out the father figure if you're a young man or even a man in midlife and you've still got some grit and some friction towards your relationship with your father. What if you brought in a bit of healthy masculinity and gave that as a gift in a reparenting context to your wounded inner child? Something to consider, a mistake that I see many people making. Just make sure you're balanced in both parenting principles, as generalized and stereotyped as I can be for just a 3-minute explanation. Let's move on to the third principle. The inner child is not the true self. This is something, unfortunately, that Charles Whitfield stumbles into himself. This book is from the 1980s, and there are chapters in this. Here we go. I'm not going to go into it because otherwise it goes into a whole rant. I've spoken about this before at length. There are whole chapters in this book where Charles Whitfield says that the inner child is the true self or the real self. But how is that possible? If you're setting up your inner child as the true self, which is embedded in the past, and it's some forgotten, nostalgia-based fantasy of where your real identity is. It's in the past, it's inaccessible, and yet at the same time, it's what you're craving and clutching towards. You're setting yourself up for neurosis. Are you more of your true self at age 5 or age 55? It's an impossible question. What defines the true self? Are we talking about an ego complex and an ego structure? Are we talking about the psyche overall, any particular archetypal entity, any particular part, the soul, consciousness itself, or self with a capital S? The further that you go into psychological study, especially at these intermediate and advanced levels, you start to break down the terminology. But what's fundamentally clear to me, that simple question, age 5 versus age 55, which is more of your true self? Surely, from my perspective, if you have a soulful element, let's say some God-given divine spark of unique character and identity, maybe even a mission in this world, that is embedded within the 5-year-old version of you, but there's much more actualization 50 years later once you've developed the ability to speak, to teach, to create, to lead, to experience, to love, to build relationships. Your self-actualized lover can't be existing in a 5-year-old boy or girl because you've yet to become a married man or woman with children, or with great multi-decade friendships, or with wonderful spiritual connections. Yes, there's the true self or the authentic spark of childhood, but that shouldn't be confused with the real self, the real, true essence of you. It's a mistake that people make, and it might seem like a pedantic point, but if you look at your inner child work and you still have this nostalgic vision for the real you being in the past, you really are setting yourself up for a very unhappy future. What if your real you extends across the full timeline and there's something spiraling along the decades? That spark stays with you until your final breath. It's not the part, it's not the archetype, and it's not any particular point on your timeline. Just be aware of this point, because it's going to set you up for actual integration in proportion to your future self-actualizing trajectory. Let's move on to the fourth point for the video. And this is interesting. This is the tyranny of playfulness. I wanted to start this video off with a joke about how we're sending our inner children down to the Lego mines and they're singing hi-ho, hi-ho. It's off to work we go, and they've got the little miner hats on. They've got the little Lego pickaxes, and they're forced to play all day. That's what they must do. My inner child must play, and they better bloody well enjoy mining out those Lego bricks and making them into something. But you can see the metaphor, as silly as it is. That's work. It might be a playful setting. Maybe they're in the Lego mine and maybe they get to play with the bricks, but it's slave labor. It's slave labor as a metaphor because we've tyrannized playfulness as a responsibility for the inner child, forgetting that when you were a child, there were moments that you can probably remember where you had something that was even more contemplative or more spiritual, and you were looking towards the bigger picture of the world, or moments on the other side of the spectrum where you were very sad, very melancholic, and you felt some pain at a deep level. Maybe a family member died, maybe a pet died, maybe you saw something really sad with one of your friends. You had a deeper, more mature understanding, even if you were a small person. We don't have just playfulness. We don't have just playfulness as the only responsibility of the inner child. I will recommend this book because it's relevant, which is Visions of Innocence, about the spiritual experiences of childhood. It's a fantastic book by Edward Hoffman. I'm still working through it myself, but if you're looking at the spiritual experiences within the inner child psychology, it's easy to see that playfulness is not the only temperament. And we've tyrannized playfulness. And where this is important, at the advanced level of inner work, again, basic inner child concepts, I get it. You're stuck in your 9-to-5 job, and if you free up your inner child, you'll get more joy and vitality. This is all true, but it's very cliche. Someone who's got a dead spirit and a numb body will feel a tangible sense of vitalization if they bring back all of that inner child playfulness. But at the advanced level, if you fragment your ability to play into inner child time and then adult time, all you've done is compartmentalize play as an inner child concept, roughly speaking, and work as an adult concept. So what happens for the 50 or 60 years of adult life when work and play can exist within the adult context in particular? Why do you jump ship into the inner child psychology? Why must it be that you're in work mode and then it's play mode? You create this artificial duality. I want to see people enjoying adult play, which looks very different from childlike play. Yes, enjoy the childlike play, but just watch out for the potential associations of become a bit too congested in your psychology that play is fundamentally a childlike thing. There's adult playfulness, and it can feel and look very different, especially in a romantic context, for example, compared to the inner child's playfulness. Might seem like a technical point, but if you're picking up what I'm putting out, just pay attention to it. Don't give your inner child the tyrannical, slave-like responsibility to head off to the Lego mines, because you're going to be hurting their well-being, and you've also lost the ability to see that they do indeed have more spiritual parts and more melancholic parts, even within the part of the inner child. Maybe it's mood, maybe it's temperament, but again, this takes us on to the fifth point for this video, the fifth mistake that I see people making, which is more specifically, they're ignoring the multiple temperaments of the inner child. These 2 points have a crossover. Playfulness is not the only mode of being, that's point number 4. Point number 5 is that the temperament of the child, as I just mentioned, is so versatile. I bet you can remember moments when you were dropped off at a family friend's place, or maybe one of your parents tried to connect with you, and they just didn't match your mood. You were in a reflective mood, you were drawing on your own, you were writing a story, you were doing something in the garden, and they come in with either way too much energy or not enough energy. They were too distant or too close, and they spoiled the scene. They overwrote your experience of joy in that moment because they couldn't match the idea that you had something that was a bit more nuanced and creative going on, something that at the very least was a lot more present than let's go and do something really exciting, or you just stay over there, I'm going to make no connection with you. It's especially obvious if you ever have any memories from between the age of like 5 to 8, when you were with a family friend or maybe with a school teacher, and they gave you baby talk. Remember one of those moments when you had just grown out of being a small child, and the frustration that a parent or any adult figure bought you a baby's gift, or they were talking to you like a baby, or they didn't understand that you could already tie your shoes, you can already make yourself a meal, you can definitely navigate your way 5 minutes down the road to go and see your friend or whatever it might be. There was that moment around age 5 to age 8 when consciousness is shifting and you're becoming more of a little boy or a little girl rather than a toddler consciousness, and it becomes fragmenting. If that irritated you back then, if you have memories of your parents bruising the scene, just be aware of when you're doing the same thing to your own inner child. Maybe your inner child doesn't want to go and play today. Maybe they want to reflect on the sadness of the family pet that died, or something that was difficult with their mother or father. Inner child work isn't just a tyrannical pursuit of joy. It's also working with father wound and mother wound as just two examples, and looking at the dynamics between your relationship and their relationship, historically speaking, to do some real developmental psychology and real unconscious healing. Just watch out for it. The fifth point and the fourth point in this video kind of cross over, but hopefully you pick up the idea that the temperament and the character of the inner child is unique, and also the broadest point, to zoom it all out, there are many different temperaments of children overall, in the same way that my character and my personality is different to your character, and your personality, you take a classroom full of 30 children, there are quiet ones, there are loud ones, there are ones who are way more confident, ones who are a bit more shy. Treat your inner child in the calibrated way that you were as an inner child, and you will heal over those moments of miscalibration when adults and bigger children didn't see you for who they were, not because it was necessarily a malicious move, they just didn't know any better. But you do know better. You remember who you were as a child. Again, age 5, age 10, age 15, everywhere in between, even maybe your earliest memories, age 2, age 3. You can remember what that felt like on the inside. And you can give yourself the witnessing and the mirroring of what you really wanted in your own reflective practice, and create rituals and processes which mirror the child that you actually were, rather than giving cookie-cutter advice tilted towards just mother principle or father principle, or something that you've seen on the internet which actually isn't calibrated to what you need. For example, if you don't want to be in a large group, don't go and do group therapy where you're all playing together in a big parachute, or, I don't know, doing some kind of dance thing together. If your inner child wanted alone time and the wound is not being alone enough, do something privately in the forest with your inner child, and vice versa. If you felt like you never got to be around people and you have that deep longing to make friendships and connections because you were a very lonely child who was always looking out the window, looking for someone to play with, go into social settings. Two very easy examples, just calibrate to your inner child as they actually were. And the sixth point, it leads on from this, and it's a bit more of a shadow work perspective. And I'm going to get the opportunity to bring out my, I will say it, the ugliest front cover of any book in this library. It is The Dark Side of the Inner Child. Check this out. If you're listening to this, just look at the screen. That is some proper late 1990s, early 2000s word clip art. It is horrifically put together. But the title speaks for the book itself. The Dark Side of the Inner Child. Your inner child is not love and light and all things sugar and spice. You can read this book if you want to, but the idea is fundamentally very simple. The inner child can be a brat. The inner child can be extremely irritating and also very immoral, and in some cases cause great harm to both themselves and other people, not necessarily because they're intentionally being evil. They just don't know any better. You've seen 7-year-olds get into fights or do cruel things. You've seen these horrific moments where some child has done something which steals or takes or hurts from another child, or a child says something particularly cruel to one of their parents, and you've probably done this. You've probably got some shameful memories in there of when you did something that hurt a brother or sister, or otherwise, a secret that no one ever knows about, something that you did that you're not proud of. There's a dark side to the inner child. If you look at this idea that there's Russian dolls of the 5-year-old inside, again, I'll go back to this front cover because it captures it so wonderfully. The 5-year-old within the 10-year-old, within the 15-year-old, within the 20-year-old, etc., all the way through to your final breath on your final day. Your character, your temperament, and your ability to make moral choices is embedded from an early age. 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds can understand the concept of right and wrong. I'm not asking you to punish yourself, but if you want to get to the advanced level of understanding about your inner child, you can realize that maybe you had particularly selfish aspects of your childhood. Not selfish in the sense that you didn't help your parents out with the washing up or whatever was going on at some kind of abusive narrative level. I'm not talking about that. I'm not trying to shame someone. I'm talking about moments where you still have lingering shame and lingering guilt about something you did or didn't do at any point between age 3 and age 18. This is particularly important for the inner adolescent work. And I'm glad that we landed there. Choices that we made between age 12 and age 18 are very much our moral responsibilities. we're a product of parenting. We're a product of social conditions and the teaching that we receive at school and nowadays from the internet and other people around us. But you still made your own choices. You weren't entirely ignorant. There are people that you entered into relationships with. There are moments where maybe you cheated or lied or did something harmful. That's the dark side of the inner child, the dark side of the inner adolescent. And if you're looking for adult shadow work that brings back the more negatively or more destructively charged aspects of your consciousness, look back into the past and don't be surprised that it was seeded in a moment when you were much younger. If you're somebody who always loses their cool, maybe that goes back to a moment when you started having temper tantrums at age 4. It's open. It's completely open. It's for you to explore. I'm not trying to prescribe something, but just look for those patterns. Look for the pattern where you throw a victim tantrum and you get all mopey and you get detached, and look back and see, I did that when I was 6 because my mom was ignoring me. I did that when I was 15 in my first relationship because my girlfriend didn't want to come over. I threw this strop and got all cold and didn't text her for 4 days. And guess what? It worked. She came over and I won. All of that dirty energy, all of that congealed manipulation, it can go back into the past. And of course, if you don't heal the past and look for where the gaps in your psyche are, you're very likely to repeat the problems in the future. Just look out for the dark side of the inner child. And to wrap the video up, let's look out for the number one mistake that I see people making with inner child work. And if you've reached the end of this video, you're ready for this one, I'm sure. Stop love bombing your inner child. You've probably already done this. If you're interested in intermediate and advanced level inner child integration, you've already gone through the stage where you've discovered the inner child concept. Maybe you read a book like Visions of Innocence. Maybe you read a book like The Problem of the Puer Aeternus by Marie-Louise van Franz, which is more of an advanced book. Or maybe you read any of the books I recommended across this channel or in this video, and you became fascinated with the idea of the inner child for about a month or 2. You did some active imaginations, you did some journaling exercises, you got some old family photos and put them up on your mirror, and you said some affirmations to your inner child, and you did it for about a month or 2, and then you left. You stopped caring because you'd done the work, and life happens, I get it. But this is the equivalent of repeating an intense engagement and then abandoning the inner child all over again. Arguably speaking, if you reach the age of 30 or 40 and you haven't consciously done inner child work, to then go in and do 2 or 3 months of very intense inner child work and then nothing for a year, was that better or worse than not going into it in the first place? It's a hypothetical question, and I do honestly believe that it's better to have done a good, intense, focused period of inner child work. But if you're looking for lifelong integration is lifelong communication. And that means having check-in points throughout the month. Practically speaking, for me at this stage in my inner child journey, I will look at my life from an inner child perspective 2 or 3 times per month. And it might just be 5 to 10 minutes. I might be out on a walk and I think, as a positive intrusive thought, I wonder how my inner child's doing. And I'll be walking through the forest and doing in-the-moment active imagination. I'm very familiar with the concepts of my inner child at all different ages. And I see, it's my 6-year-old inner child today. They could do with some more play. With a social context, I'm going to hang out with all my friends. Oh, it's my 14-year-old inner child today. They actually feel a bit too overwhelmed by the world and they want to be left alone a bit more. I check in, I calibrate, and I line that up with my adult consciousness and my adult intentions. A couple times per month. Doesn't need to be every weekend, doesn't need to be daily journaling, but just watch out for the moment when you love bomb your own inner child. It's the equivalent of, I'm going to say it, it's the equivalent of you being ignored by one of your parents, but when you fall over and you scrape your knee or you break a bone, suddenly you're the star of the show. Let's go with a broken bone example. You're the star of the show for those 4 to 6 weeks of healing before you're basically then forgotten all over again. That's the same pattern, or the pattern of just being so overbearing, so extremely over-involved in your inner child's worries that you don't step back and give them the ability to speak their own mind. You spent too much time interrogating. You weren't intending interrogation, but you asked all these inner child questions. You were checking in every single day and then nothing. Feels more like a investigatory process followed by abandonment rather than a lifelong loving relationship that is a genuine reparenting process. As a kind of psychologically direct point that I could make to start to wrap up this video If the child within was raised over 18 years, why do you think you can integrate the inner child within 3 months of focused work? Surely it's at least another 18 years, and if you're looking psychologically at the archetypal structures and the different ways that the parts and sub-personalities interface, it's the rest of your life. It's an active communication, so just watch out for the fascination wave that then leads to the abandonment. This is an emotional dysregulation, as repeated within the active imaginal or sub-personality-based parts work. I'll rapidly summarize all of the points just to end this video, and then I will see you in the comment section because we can all share our stories. Point number 1, first mistake to avoid making: the inner child is not a single age. 0 to 18, find the benchmarks along the way and draw out the connections. Number 2, you need both the mother principle and the father principle. If you're lopsided one way or the other, consider building out the opposite. Read masculine, feminine psychology, learn how to heal your mother wound and father wound, and then apply that energy in a loving and consistent way to the child within. Number 3, your inner child is not your true self. Age 5 to age 55, your true self extends all the way through, and from my perspective, self-actualization becomes more of a materialized, true actuality, truly self-actualized, the older we go into life, because we have the ability to express that essence in more mature, sophisticated, and tangible ways. Don't look back into your past with the nostalgic, rose-tinted glasses of how things used to be when you were your real self. You're always your real self, and you become more real and more true, arguably speaking, as you go deeper into life. Number 4, adult play versus childlike play. Just watch out for if you've already compartmentalized playfulness into inner child things on the evening or the weekend, and adult serious responsibilities for when you're working during the week. It's an easy mistake to make, and if you open this up, things will start to shift and your work week will get naturally a little bit more playful, and your inner child won't feel tyrannized down the Lego minds with work becoming slavery, and because playfulness becomes work, and you remember the point. Number 5 point to remember: temperament and character. Every child in the classroom has a different nature. You had a particular nature. Don't apply cookie-cutter parenting advice that avoids and overlooks the exact nature of your temperament as an inner child. The closer that you can get to who you were when you were little, and love them in the way that they needed on the different moods and different temperaments within the overall character structure, you're going to be so much more close, so much better. It's just going to be warm, a warmer, more loving, more honest relationship with your inner child. Number 6, of course, love and light is fantastic, but don't forget that there is a dark side to your inner child. And number 7, watch out for unintentionally love bombing your inner child. Don't repeat this pattern of sudden immersion and then sudden avoidance. Stop ghosting a 6-year-old that was you. Just don't do it. Be more consistent. Just a couple times per month. I probably spend no more than 25 to 30 minutes per month just ambiguously reflecting, or when I'm reading a book, I think about it. It becomes a living organic process. Doesn't need to be too intense, but it shouldn't be nothing. And then suddenly everything. And then nothing. That's a dysregulation in itself. 7 mistakes that people make. This has been a whirlwind video. Again, you can go back and find these books I recommended throughout the video. But just look after your inner child. They deserve it.